Good morning and welcome to today's podcast with UOWD On-Air. My name is Feras Hamza and I'm the head of the School of Humanities, Social Sciences and Health at the University of Wollongong in Dubai. Today we will be discussing the phenomena of the job search anxiety, how it manifests, how significant the phenomena is actually, and whom does it affect, and perhaps what to do about it. But before we get started, I'm very excited to have with me today two experts who will be helping me better understand this phenomena and to possibly offer strategies for managing this anxiety. I'll let my guests introduce themselves. So I guess over to you, Ollie, first.
Morning, my name's Ollie. I'm an associate professor of psychology and I work at the University of Wollongong.
And Hopolang.
Hi, my name is Hopolang Matte. I'm a clinical psychologist and I work at the Lighthouse Arabia Center for Wellbeing in Dubai.
Well, thank you for joining me this morning. Just to get a sense of what we're talking about here. Anxiety is a kind of perennial human condition, I suppose, and it's always of concern. What is it about the first job search or job search anxiety that makes us worth talking about, and perhaps even the demographic that it affects most? So why don't I start with you, Dr. Hopolang?
I think, considering that we're at a university, I think the job search will always, be heightened in anxiety for university students, freshly graduates or newly graduates. Let's first normalize anxiety. Okay, there's people who have no anxiety, and I think that's a dangerous place to be because then you don't have a sense of, I think, like zest for life to go for the thing. Right? And then you have what is optimal anxiety, which each human being should sort of try get to and have, because it's what gives us the sense of care to do what we need. But I think what we're going to talk about today is what we call disordered anxiety. This is where then the individual feels paralyzed. I think the demographic we'd have to understand two job seekers in my mind. A newly graduate who has no interview experience, who has no working experience, who is freshly going out into the employment world, and somebody who has some experience or has sought out a job before. And I think the impact would look different between those two demographics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and would you say it's a function of the age? I mean, this demographic that we're talking about that concerns us, because, I mean, is it not true after all that anxiety never leaves the world of jobs? I mean, we have, then you get the job, then you have the deadlines, you have the pressures to produce, to meet deadlines, and to meet expectations as well, and to live up to the job role. So, is it something about the age group here?
I think there's something about the age and the maturity of the age. I think there's something about the inexperience. I think there's something about when you're a university graduate, all depending on the program you've been in, is to study, produce theoretical knowledge, some sort of application, I would hope, in the program. But there's a difference between the production of performance and output in a university and in a working environment. So it's also like the unknown, what to expect. It's one thing to read about something, it's another thing to do it.
Sure.
So I think there's a lot of performance anxiety because of inexperience.
Okay. Well, now that you've set the ball rolling, I'm going to go to my colleague, Dr. Oliver Bones here. Ollie, I want to know how unfair we are being when we're trying to suggest that the kind of anxiety associated with the first job search is, worthy of the kind of concern that we now show towards other, perhaps diagnoses of the age, ADHD, students who have trouble, dyslexia, other forms of challenges that are kind of clinically legitimate, if you like. I mean, Dr. Hopolang herself said, I'm just going to kind of be the devil's advocate here, she said actually some anxiety is good. I mean, it gives us that sense of drive, right? And in fact, I've heard, musicians say that before going on stage, they need that anxiety, otherwise they won't perform. So how do we know what's legitimately of concern, what's just good enough for you, to train you?
Yes, I think, first-time job-seeking anxiety is a real confluence. I mean, anybody and everybody will have experienced it. It is very, very anxiety-provoking, and I think that's because it is a real confluence of factors. And we can probably kind of group these into maybe three areas. There's a kind of internal source of anxiety, a kind of societal source, and then I think there is also factors that are inherent to job seeking that are just inherently anxiety provoking. So from sort of internal perspective, I mean, we are evolved to be acutely sensitive to the threat of rejection. And there's good reasons for that, because rejection from the group is a threat to our survival, historically. And so the threat of being, rejected by an authority figure in an interview setting, for example, is just that, that will set all of our alarm bells ringing, which manifests as anxiety. If we're talking about the age group in particular, some of the societal factors, I sort of hesitate to bring up the spectra of social media, but of course, if you're comparing all of your internal anxieties to the carefully curated success stories on social media, where you kind of, it will definitely, that's very conducive to feeling anxious. And then the process itself is inherently unpredictable, and there are so many factors that are out of your control, and that itself is very, structurally conducive to provoking anxiety. And especially if you consider that a lot of graduates looking for jobs for the first time will be leaving an environment that is very structured, academic, pathways, assessments on a deadline, and we try to make things as kind of clear and structured for our students as possible.
We do more these days as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And whereas a lot of jobs, sort of job application processes are very oblique, a lot of ambiguity, but often not very well put together. The forms that you're completing online are often not very well designed.
So these were you would group as the kind of third aspect
the kind of inherent,
that
are kind of structurally part of a job seeking process. And so I guess my sort of first sort of point that I guess I'd like to kind of highlight is that all of this is incredibly normal. Feeling anxious is very normal, and to sort of return to your point about anxiety serving a purpose. I mean, it does in the sense that it alerts us to threat, but of course evolution happens on a very slow time scale, and so the threats that we are alert to are not always as relevant. Being rejected from a job is not life threatening. But of course we don't necessarily sort of think in those terms, and so I think there's a sense in which kind of rationalism and reasoning is useful, which is to say that recognizing that anxiety is normal, that is useful. But at the same time, I don't think there's any value, or I don't know how useful it is to try to rationalize away the feeling of anxiety. I think a more useful approach is perhaps acceptance that being anxious is normal. And let's work in spite of it, and not let our anxiety dictate how we respond in that situation.
That's interesting, but isn't it also true that also has a sense of how much you can accept is also part of what kind of individual you are? I mean, is that anxiety, Dr. Hopolang, if I go over to you, like you're a clinical psychologist. I mean, you're in the profession itself. You must be seeing this age group, this demographic in its distress. Does it usually come with other challenges that the individual faces? I mean, is it that they're more prone to other kinds of clinical kind of, perhaps disorders, that they become more prone to anxiety for job, in the context of job seeking? Are they generally anxious individuals, or is it just something about the job search that makes it actually worthy? Because I'm wondering whether if you're a naturally anxious person and you have other kinds of, perhaps you have a negativity perhaps approach to life, a lot of it compounds the situation. I'm wondering whether there's a kind of certain profile that makes it challenging.
I mean, we can talk about concepts along the lines of sort of internal and external loci of control. I mean, so people that are predisposed to understand the world as being something that just happens to them or something that they can act upon. I think those are important predictors. But I think, I don't know, I mean, I suppose the extent to which we struggle with anxiety, so the emphasis on the word struggle as opposed to the extent to which we experience anxiety is probably more predictive of things like procrastination, for example, which is going to be a problem for job seekers. Because, you know, if you are very scared of feeling anxious, and, you know, the feeling of anxiety is something that you really are predisposed to fight and struggle and try to rationalize, the tendency is to avoid that feeling or to avoid getting into a situation that will provoke that feeling. And so that can lead to things like procrastination. And of course, the irony there is that, you know, the worst thing objectively that can happen if you submit a job application is that you get rejected, which is the same outcome as if you don't submit it in the first place. You know, you don't get the job.
Guaranteed no.
A guaranteed no rather than a possible no. So I guess, I think to sort of speak to your point about, you know, are there profiles that are predictive of, you know, the extent to which we struggle with anxiety? I think if you are predisposed to approach situations as a problem to resolve rather than accepting that this is a process which is out of your control to an extent, you can do what you can do. You can prepare. There are things we can perhaps come on to around, you know, how to, you know, in the moment to not get kind of swept away by anxiety. But ultimately, I think if you are accepting of discomfort to an extent, then I think that's probably quite a good predictor of people that.
I mean, I something about the second category of reasons that you were talking about, the kind of societal or social aspects of that. I imagine that it's very challenging to be a young person, full stop, at the moment. I mean, so that's what I was looking at, other kind of, you know, other factors that are confounding the situation, making it not just about the job search itself, like social expectations, peer pressure. I don't know. Dr. Hopolang?
So, I mean, before I get into the social aspect, going back to your question of the profile, I think one of the other things that I come across a lot in practice is the lack of emotional regulation, for example. So if we're talking comorbidity and a lot of factors operating at the same time, you find that a lot of young people haven't developed the skill or the muscle for emotional regulation. So then if we're talking social rejection, I don't know what I'm feeling, I don't know what to do with what I'm feeling, it's going to confound the anxiety levels and intensity, you know, which sort of links to your question of how do we know when it's out of hand, when it's excessive, and what is normal, as my colleague has said. That's one. You're quite right. I think it's very hard being a young person in this day and age. I think there's a lot of competitiveness. I think with social media, with technology, and us being globalized, there are pros and cons to it. The pros that we're connected, we know what's happening in the world. However, I mean, yesterday when I was just thinking of the topic, I was looking up unemployment rates in the UAE. Okay, in the UAE, it's a thriving society, it's a developing economy, so there's opportunities, and actually unemployment is decreasing. Globally, it's decreasing. However, if you think of just globally, the countries that are then have higher rates of unemployment. So, for example, South Africa is like one of them. It's number 2. Those graduates are then part of the competition of certain regions. Like here, they're all going to try get employment.
Right.
So the competitiveness, the age, the identity. If you're thinking of a newly qualified graduate, you're somewhere between the ages of 20, 23, depending on when you actually finish high school. You're in that identity formation. Who am I? So I think job seeking brings anxiety societally, because you're still trying to also prove yourself. Who am I? Find myself, get acceptance from an authority figure, which would be your employer. So I think there's a lot of factors that put pressure on this demographic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember this kind of thing at 16. I remember that there were jobs out there, you just had to find them. It doesn't feel like it's the same now. I mean, look at my daughter's age group, you know, they're constantly applying for infinite numbers of internships just to be able to then rack them up, I suppose, on the CV before getting a full-time position, or the hope of a full-time position. So it seems to be it's much more intense, and everybody's looking, everybody's watching.
I do think statistically it's relevant because globally, a lot of countries aren't doing so well economically. So I think there are, in certain regions, less jobs. And I think we cannot ignore then the competitiveness. I think there's an unspoken hierarchy of the type of job that job seekers will lean towards. And so
are you saying that there are enough jobs? My point about jobs being out there doesn't hold, because most of the young people are going for particular jobs because they're more attractive, and so that's where the stress is.
I think there's that, but there's also the requirements have also increased.
Okay.
So if I think of when I looked for a job, so I used to lecture. At some point, you needed just a master's. Now you need a PhD to lecture. So I wonder if there's also like a shift in the requirements that then creates anxiety, that creates competitiveness. Whilst job or your employer knows that you are inexperienced in the training programs, but I think there is a shift in requirements. There is an elitism in what kind of job and field you go into. I mean, we're in tech now. The development of AI, I think a lot of people are geared towards that. There's only so many of us that can go into that field, whilst there's a lot of opportunity. Yeah.
Ollie, on your thoughts on
the sort of structural issues in the job market? I mean, I don't speak from a position of particular being particularly informed, but my sense is that I think you're right in that I think students, or graduates rather, they strive to be successful earlier. I think there's an emphasis that your first job must be the job, the right job, and to be on your career path from the moment you step out of university, which I don't feel like that was the case necessarily sort of 10, 15 years ago. And I'm not quite sure what to put that down to. I don't know.
I think I would also, to that point, I would be curious what it means for a graduate. I think depending which graduate we're talking about, I think your first job, what does it mean to get your first job? I think we're heading into that identity. I am seeing clinically a lot of people wanting to be successful earlier, and I don't know what that is about.
Yeah. A function of the change of society. So surely, I mean, we don't no longer live in kind of big units. There's every individual has to support themselves, and so there's that many more jobs required of a kind of social unit, and so that's part of the pressure, I suppose. And also, I wonder what you think. The Ministry of Education here in the UAE recently had a kind of radical restructuring of the accreditation process for programs, and now, I mean, most of the way that universities will be able to accredit programs with the ministry will be based on certain KPIs, and one of the big KPIs for that is how soon students get jobs after graduating. So, the pressure is from all sides. I mean, if the ministry is only, I suppose, reflecting a wider societal kind of perspective that it is about jobs. I do put my foot down. I kind of morally state that there was a time when education was for education's sake and not for just getting a job, but it's not what our young graduates are thinking.
I think they approach education in a much more transactional way. I mean, I'm paying these fees for a degree that will get me this job.
Yeah.
And that's the end. It's a sort of means to an end, rather than a good in itself almost.
Yeah, it's a kind of mad conveyor belt rush. So, I'm interested about this, and just to go back for a moment to the science behind this, because I'd like to hear your kind of what is typically the kind of clinical case that you see. I mean, is it the actual fear of failure or not feeling not good enough? Or is it what my friends will think? Is it what my family? I mean, is it just a nice cocktail of all of these things?
I think you've sort of started the cocktail.
Yeah.
I think all those factors play a role. You find I see a lot of imposter syndrome.
Oh. You want to say what that is for our...
Yes.
Because the students might be listening thinking they're
I think in layman's terms, imposter syndrome is feeling like a fraud, feeling like I do not belong. Am I good enough? Am I intelligent enough?
Okay.
And so for a graduate or a student who hasn't gone into a particular space, I think the anxiety you see is, when are they going to realize that I'm not the one? So even in a job interview, right? You prepare, you want it, you desire the job, you've worked all your life for it, or and it's, when are they going to realize that I don't know what I'm talking about? Off air, you were talking about fake it till you make it, and I always say to clients, I particularly don't subscribe to fake it till you make it, because I think
it kind of aggravates, might aggravate a pre-existing.
Yeah, I think it wires your mind to say that you are an imposter, versus I am working my way to meeting myself to be qualified for that internship or graduate program, and I am exactly where I should be, which is theoretical knowledge, graduate level. So you see imposter syndrome, you see perfectionism a lot. These unrelenting standards, it's all or nothing thinking. It must be perfect, right? I must be perfect. And imagine a graduate comparing themselves to you. You've been in the workforce for a long time, and this is what you see, these unrealistic standards going into the job market. A lot of validation. I think identity is a big one. What does it mean for me to get a job? I'm now leaving a school setting. So if you think from high school to university, it's that structural, sort of way of living, the assignments, I know what to do, I know what to expect. You've been prepared for it majority of your life. This is a shift in identity. It's a different kind of responsibility. It's a different kind of pressure. It's a different kind of value system, be it societal or familial.
I mean, you'll both have to forgive me for pretending to be anything like a psychologist or a clinical psychologist, but I'm going to push this point a bit more. Do you not feel, given the examples that you just gave, that these kind of come together in some sense? I mean, you can club these. The perfectionism might come with imposter syndrome, might be related to negativity bias, might be closely related to self-confidence. I mean, it seems like they're all potential aggravations of the same profile. And so that's why initially I was wondering whether when you started the podcast, whether, you can immediately identify a kind of person who's more prone to these pitfalls.
I'll even speak to the science of temperament. So we're all born with a particular type of temperament, right? So internal, external factors. But if I was born with an anxious temperament already, and externally my environment hasn't nurtured that, hasn't identified that, hasn't assisted me earlier on, that child or that person continues to grow with that pessimistic way of life. Life happens to me. I don't have the tools to know what to do. And so then it just persists.
Okay.
But I wouldn't say that perfectionistic tendencies cause imposter syndrome. I would rather phrase it as this cocktail, they all influence one another.
Yeah.
You're likely to, live or struggle with anxiety more if you have these factors operating within you.
I mean, imposter syndrome is incredibly prevalent, isn't it? I mean, and certainly in academia, it's a bit of an endemic. And it's very resistant to objective evidence to the contrary, which makes it very challenging. And so potentially, I don't know what your thoughts are, but potentially, a sort of self-compassion is perhaps a key kind of, is a key factor in kind of, dealing with that sense of being somewhere where you shouldn't be, sort of treating yourself as you would treat a loved one,
So now that you've touched upon a kind of coping mechanism, what are some of the coping mechanisms that we might advise to our this tender demographic that we're talking about? What are some of the things that we might...
Yeah.
I mean, Dr. Hopolang, you just mentioned you were a lecturer. Yes. I mean, so students of psychology have no advantage here, right? This is the kind of expert blind spot. They can't...
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think there is an extent to which... one can apply reason and knowledge and understanding of the mechanisms involved. As I said before, understanding that anxiety is an evolutionary mechanism to alert us to threat, and therefore it is a normal feeling. that's useful knowledge that I think, psychology students should hopefully have some grasp of. But but you're right, it doesn't protect you from feeling anxiety. But in terms of kind of, things that you can concretely do, I mean, I'd like to hear your views as well, but I think, as I said at the start, I think accepting anxiety as something that is going to be with you in this situation, because it is a structurally anxiety-provoking situation, but practicing things like, defusing from thoughts that are not useful. So by defusing, I mean, we are all very prone to mistaking our thoughts for an objective truth and, being our self. If I'm thinking this thought, that is myself speaking, whereas actually it's just our brain producing language and thoughts. It's a kind of cognitive process which we can choose to engage with and, sort of chase after. We can choose to try and, rationalize our way through this problem, or we can decide to go, oh, that's just my thoughts. I'm going to step back from that. I don't need to engage with that in this moment. I'm going to listen to what the interviewer is actually saying to me rather than being distracted by an anxiety-provoking, inner critic. So practicing those kind of things, just kind of recognizing a thought as a thought. And there are methods where you can kind of reframe your inner voice in a silly voice to make it sound less, compelling or less like an objective truth. So I think that's a useful thing that we can do.
But to do that, you need to. It sounds that you need help finding that voice. If you're that prone to anxiety, are you able to kind of make that transition yourself, or do you need to seek help? I mean, do you need to ask a clinical psychologist?
I'd say yes and no. It depends on. If we think of anxiety on a spectrum, okay, if you are living with mild or moderate anxiety, perhaps there's some intervention there that would be required. But I think there's something about recognizing that I live with anxiety, and I phrase it that way, right? I am of the school of thought, I don't have anxiety, I feel anxiety. I live with anxiety because then there's life force in that versus feeling crippled. As my colleague is saying, I think there's something important in how you frame things and that inner critic, your voice. So we all have an inner voice. If we can just start with the basics, recognize that you have an inner voice. What does he or she sound like? I keep it very basic. What does my inner voice sound like? Does it sound harsh? Is it critical? Is it loud? What is the tone? What is the personality? Imagine them. Speak to them as a friend, invite them to the dinner table. So the younger the demographic I work with, I say, invite them to the table, and this would link into acceptance. If you accept that I'm prone or live with anxiety, then you can work with it. I think a lot of people try to dismiss it, ignore it, and then it paralyzes you because it catches you off guard. Once you've accepted that I am prone to feel nervous or anxious in certain situations, and it is leaning towards not assisting me in a helpful way, then you can do things like you're going to prepare for those anxious situations like an interview. It's not a once-off. I think people do this fight or flight thing where today I'm coming on the podcast, I may be feeling nervous, so I will prepare today and hope for the best that the breathing technique works. No. You have to have a relationship, an ongoing, consistent relationship with yourself. You need to notice the physiological. What is happening inside my body? Am I trembling? Am I feeling tense? When did that start? I knew 2 weeks ago about this interview. What are they looking for, right? Doing research, for example, on the company, so that cognitively the thoughts you're having can be met with facts. You can have a thought, a distorted thought like, I am not going to get the job because I am not qualified. You have not looked at the job description. You have not researched the company in relation to the degree that you have. And so it's not fact that you're not going to get the job. You just need to research. Once you've researched, you'll find that, oh, my heart rate is decreasing. Or my thoughts are racing less. Physiologically, I'm calm. But that is not something you do the day before. That is not something you Band-Aid and do once in a while.
Okay. So you need to train yourself and get into a kind of discipline of knowing how to deal or speak to that.
Absolutely, diagnosis or not.
Yeah. Can parents do something in this context, I suppose, because they're the first kind of, the first order of presence after the individual? Because parents listening might be thinking, well, am I pushing too hard? Am I aggravating the situation? But, I imagine if a parent spoke like you just did, that would be might be reassuring, might be have a calming effect. Or no, it doesn't work that way, parents and children.
I'll answer as a parent and as a professional.
Good, double.
As a parent, I can empathize with our own anxieties. I don't think that there's a parent out there who doesn't desire for their child to flourish and thrive. To some degree, this is not a healthy thing, but I'll own it. Your child thriving means you've done something, right? So it's, so I think that causes a little bit of anxiety in parents themselves. However, my recommendation to myself and other parents is always, the more you regulate yourself, the more you are a resource or a helpful resource to your dysregulated child.
Okay.
Notice, identify, acknowledge your anxieties so that you have space and room for their anxieties. Notice your inner critic. Notice where you are critical to them, not maliciously, but in the hope of wanting them to thrive. Educate yourself with the language of psychology and just humanity in general, so that you can teach them the language. If you know I feel statements, if you know the spectrum of feelings, it's not always anxiety, by the way. Just if any graduate will be listening to this, the same physiological experience of anxiety, you have similar physiological experiences of excitement. So when you're seeking to find a job, there's some sort of excitement. Your heart racing isn't always anxiety.
Yeah.
So I think for parents, educating themselves on those differences so that they can assist when their children are paralyzed, to help them with the language and the tools and the skills. Do it together. The diaphragm breathing. I mean, we could drop a lot of tools here, but I think it's parent educating themselves first. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think that sounds like great advice.
So in what module of psychology would our students be learning this little trick? I mean, I always say it's funny when, you study a discipline that itself offers the remedies, but you can't quite, perhaps. I was thinking of the irony of a graduate of psychology undergoing this kind of anxiety, the stress, even having studied psychology. But I guess
these are natural responses.
These are natural responses.
An intellectual understanding doesn't protect you from a natural emotional response.
Do we think that there are other strategies that we might help? I mean, one of the things you said, Dr. Hopolang, is that sometimes by doing enough research, you can kind of almost get a grip on, control that anxiety. But can you overdo it? Like, overthink it, over researching. I haven't done enough. And so it's related to that, I think, perfectionism you're talking about.
No, go ahead.
I think that you can have like a zoomed in focus lens on trying to do the right thing all the time and be perfect. And that in itself will create anxiety. No matter the tool you're applying, I think there's something about creating distance between you and the thing. Having an aerial view of things is helpful. Knowing your limit of, I'm doing the best that I can. I think and normalizing anxiety. I think that there is an how would you describe it? Is it an over focus? Is it a
sort of pathologizing
of anxiety? Anxiety is normal. The goal isn't to not have any anxiety at all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? Because then you don't detect threat. You don't detect that actually the job market is competitive. I should prepare. I should have answers. I should know why I want that company, what the company. You won't do the thing that helps you thrive if you don't have a little bit of anxiety. The goal is for it to be optimal and functional. So don't over pathologize you feeling nervous. I would be worried if I was a student and I came into a job interview and I was completely calm.
Yes.
Really relaxed.
There's a difference between calm and confident.
Yeah.
Those are two different, calm, confident, and not having the life drive to care. You will not pass an exam if you do not study. To study, you have to feel a little bit scared that I might not pass.
Yeah, sure.
You know?
Makes sense.
I think just in terms of kind of practical tips for any kind of, graduates applying for jobs that are listening to this, I think another very simple but useful thing to think about is kind of present moment awareness. Because this is such a inherently anxiety provoking process, the tendency to get swept away with concerns and thoughts, thinking about future situations, thinking about past situations, and not actually using the time and applying the energy to the present moment task. I think that's a big problem or a big challenge. And that sort of phenomenon of where you've got a job application that you're very anxious about and you've got 2 hours to do it, and then an hour's passed and you've not done anything because you've just been sat there thinking about things that are so simple breathing exercises, kind of body awareness, these kinds of things I think are actually very useful, not just in that situation, but if you're in an interview, for example, because if you kind of get swept away by worrying about what the interviewer's thinking of you, how am I coming across? Do I sound nervous? And then you miss what the interviewer is even saying to you. So that's, so again, just kind of coming into the moment. Or if you're, sort of networking, you're trying to find job opportunities, being present in a conversation is very important, and it makes you a good party to a conversation. So, I think just simple breathing exercises and sort of body awareness exercises can be very useful.
And I think giving yourself the permission to pause in an interview. Okay, if you've missed a question because you're so wrapped up in your thoughts, like you say, theoretically this is easier said than done. You give yourself the permission to say, excuse me, sorry, can you repeat the question? Acknowledging in the interview that I'm feeling a bit nervous, sorry, I missed what you said. Can I take a moment to think about it? So the art or the tool of pausing, so that you can just gather yourself and do the breathing and then respond.
And not personalizing, I suppose, as well. One of the things I've noticed over the years is how the response from what used to be called HR, now it's called people and culture, I suppose, in many corporate, they've modified how to respond to you when they reject you. So I suppose they've recognized that there is a tendency to personalize rejection as well, when there must be, everybody else is being rejected.
So a very useful kind of way of framing that, I think, is understanding, self as context rather than, if you are being rejected for a job application, that's because the job market is competitive. That's because there's lots of other people applying, and there is a inherently random element to this. It isn't anything fundamental about you that is being rejected. This is the situation that you are in. So as you say, trying not to identify too much with rejection is, again, easier said than done, but I think quite important.
I call that the tool of alternatives. So one of the one of the options is that I wasn't good enough. Okay, fine, maybe. But what are the other alternatives? So find evidence to qualify those thoughts. The market is competitive. What is the other alternative? They could only hire one person. What is the other alternative? You may be better suited to something else. So qualifying the thought, but also finding alternatives for the rejection so that you can create this distance between you and the thing. They're not rejecting me, but there are other alternatives as to why I was not picked for that position in that role at that time.
Any final thoughts? I think we have covered a nice range of the factors involved, the kind of perhaps some of the coping mechanisms that you can look to, and don't panic. Anxiety is a natural part of life.
We've covered a lot, but I think just be kind to yourself. This is a tough process, and everybody's been through it, and nobody's really enjoyed it, I don't think.
And there's still lots of other things to get across. That's going through life. I think you realize that the challenges persist, and I think the earlier perhaps that you cultivate that sense, that resilience and that mindfulness, will serve you later on for life. Well, it just remains for me to thank my guest, Dr. Oliver Bones, Associate Professor of Psychological Science here at the University of Wollongong, and Dr. Hopolang Matte from the Lighthouse Arabia for joining me this morning on this very interesting topic of anxiety in the job search. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for more from UOWD On Air.